As preppers, there are many different types of events that we should be thinking about. Natural disasters are becoming more and more common every year. Then there's other larger scale events, things like economic downturns, economic collapses, and then even wars that are possibilities as well. Regardless of which type of event you are most worried about happening, there are some good just general preparedness things that you can do that will help you be more prepared for pretty much whatever may happen. And while talking about different types of gear is fun and it does have its place, we cannot overlook the basic fundamentals of preparedness. So today we're going to be talking about food storage, taking a look at how much food you need to have as a baseline to be ready for most things that you could face. Maybe not some bigger things, we'll get into that as well, but also take a look at the specific types of foods that you should be storing. The first thing that you need to look at when you're planning your food storage is, do you have any loved ones or members of your group that have special dietary needs? And at least for me, the first thing that comes to mind is babies. Babies cannot eat the same things that we eat for the first several months of their lives. They are going to require milk. And even if you're in a situation where, mama's breastfeeding the baby, you need to consider situations that would make that difficult or impossible to do. Maybe mom is malnourished, she's sick, stress is causing her to not produce milk the way that she normally would, or heaven forbid, mom passes away and she's not able to feed that baby anymore. So you are going to need, even if you're breastfeeding, a good supply of powdered milk that you can keep back for storage, so that if something like that happens, you're still going to be able to feed the kid. And then also some other special dietary needs. Maybe you have folks with either gluten allergies or other types of food allergies. Take, for example, my son. He cannot eat eggs, so we don't really store a whole lot of stuff that has egg products in it. Or maybe you have a diabetic in your group. So there's a lot of different types of food storage, most notably freeze-dried meals that might have allergens in them. They might not be appropriate for especially somebody with a gluten allergy, because a lot of those foods are going to have just gluten to the max because they're filled with noodles and things like that. So you got to take into consideration the special dietary needs of those around you, so that you're not just storing a bunch of food that they can't eat. Now, when it comes to which specific types of foods that you should store, I think for a lot of people, canned goods are going to be an excellent place for folks to start, and then even for experienced preppers to continue to add to their stockpiles. And things like fruits, vegetables, those are obvious, but then there's also other types of canned goods that you can pick up. Canned meats, then also, soup, chili, canned milk. And the good thing about canned goods is they're relatively cheap, they're pretty easy to find as of now, and they have a minimum shelf life usually of at least a couple of years. And when I say shelf life, I'm talking about the best by date on the can. A lot of that stuff will actually stay good for long beyond that expiration date, but it might just start to lose some nutrients, but it might still be safe to eat. Now, of course, if you have a can that's like bulging or has rust or dents on it, then you probably don't eat that, especially if it's well beyond its expiration date. But canned goods, they're also very easy to organize. If you have some sort of first in, first out can organizer, then you're going to be able to keep track of which cans you bought first. Those will be the first ones that you consume, so nothing has really much of a chance to go bad. And if you have a larger pantry, which is what I want one day, then you can do kind of a vertical can organizer where you put cans in the top, they drop down, then they come out the bottom. So it's the same exact concept as a first in, first out can organizer like what I have, but you can do it on a much, much larger scale. The next type of food that preppers should be stockpiling is going to be dry goods. And that's things like dried beans, rice, pasta, flour, cornmeal, and then even wheat berries before they've been through a mill. The good thing about dried goods is they give you a lot, and I mean an absolute lot, of bang for your buck. They're pretty darn cheap. I mean, if you know who Dave Ramsey is, there is a reason why he tells people that they are going to be eating beans for a while. If they're on his plan, it's because they are so cheap that they will allow you to put money back for other things, and I'm not advocating him or anything. It's just I know there's a lot of people that know his stuff. And there's a lot of different ways to store dried goods like this, and they kind of have different shelf lives depending on what it is. But one really good way to do that, I'm sure y'all have seen this, is to store them in Mylar bags with oxygen absorbers, then put the Mylar bags in like something like a food grade plastic bucket, which the Tractor Supply buckets, they are food grade, so that is nice. And inside this bag here, I have just white rice. Now, white rice is going to store much longer than brown rice will because brown rice has oils in it, which will cause it to go rancid much, much faster. But this white rice stored in this Mylar bag, it is going to be good for around 25 or 30 years. It might even be edible beyond that point, but there is absolutely no way for, microorganisms or even insects that their eggs might be present. There's no way for any of that to thrive in this sort of environment because there's no oxygen, there's no light penetrating through this, and rodents are going to have a pretty darn hard time getting through a plastic bucket. Now, mice probably won't. Rats could if they really wanted to, so that's why you still got to keep an eye on your stuff. Nothing is 100% foolproof unless you're storing in steel barrels or something like that. But another type of item that should have a shelf life comparable to this rice is going to be dried beans. Like I have some dried pinto beans, some black beans in this bucket, and I'll talk about how I have my buckets organized in just a second. Now, also, in addition to things like rice and beans, you can also store flour in this manner, although flour that has already been ground up, like, your bleached white flour, then also especially whole grain flour, it's not going to have nearly the shelf life that beans and rice will. I think flour stored in that way will have maybe a shelf life of, I believe, 5 to 10 years. So that's something that you still want to keep an eye on. You still want to rotate. Now, something that I'm storing that I haven't heard of a lot of people storing is going to be corn masa harina, because I am in Texas and I have grown very accustomed to having good Mexican food pretty much whenever I want to. And having that corn masa is going to allow me to make corn tortillas, which are important for tacos. I love tacos. But anyway, that's probably going to have a shelf life comparable to that of flour. Now, if you want to store flour for a longer period of time, then you're going to have to store the wheat berries as a whole, get you a nice mill, and then ground those out. Because the wheat berries, they will store for significantly longer. I think the shelf life on those, if they're stored at the same way that I had that rice in that Mylar bag, is probably going to, I think it'll be 25 to 30 years. If not, I will put a correction down here in the in my little caption bar that I have when I say stupid things, and then I have to correct myself in mid-video. So if I say something stupid mid-video, make sure that you look at the caption bar to make sure that I did not correct myself. So let's talk about how I organized my buckets for just a second. You noticed that a second ago I just kind of pulled out, that was a 1 gallon bag of rice. Now, what I've done, instead of just using one big 5-gallon Mylar bag as kind of like a liner and then filling that entire bucket with one ingredient, I have used smaller bags that will allow me to store different ingredients in the same bucket. And I think that's a really good way to go if you're in a situation like maybe you live in an apartment, you live in town, and if something really bad happens, you are going to need to bug out, because if you aren't able to get all of your supplies, maybe you're only able to grab a few of your buckets, you want to have as many different things in those buckets as possible. Now, if you live on a homestead and the chances of you bugging out aren't that great, then maybe, having just one ingredient per bucket might be a little bit better. But if you're going to have to bail, and you might have to bail quickly, then having things like, here I have some rice, have a small bag of black beans, here's some flour, then also have another gallon-sized bag of pinto beans and another gallon-sized bag of corn masa. I'm going to have a lot of different ingredients just in one bucket. Now, some downsides to doing things like this is, A, it is a lot more work. You are going to have to spend a lot more time carefully filling these bags, not dumping food everywhere. And then also, you, of course, are going to have to seal more bags. It's going to be more expensive, and you're not going to be able to store as much in here. So take that 5-gallon bucket, for example. I have 4 gallons plus I think this is a 1-quart pouch. So instead of being able to store 5 gallons of food in here, I'm storing basically 4¼ gallons. So you kind of lose some storage, but you gain the ability to have more ingredients with you with fewer buckets if you can't take everything with you for one reason or another. Another type of food that every prepper should be storing is going to be freeze-dried meals. The big downside to freeze-dried meals is that they are incredibly expensive compared to other food options, especially the ones that we've already talked about. Canned goods, and especially dry goods, they are just practically dirt cheap. And freeze-dried meals, because of the work that goes into preparing them and their packaging and their shelf life, they can get pretty pricey. So where I see freeze-dried meals, where I see their place in an overall food plan, is that first of all, they're going to be great to keep in your bug out bag. As long as you have a way to add water to them, to reconstitute them, and to heat them up, then they're a great option. Now, MREs might be a better option, so you don't have to, carry as much, you don't have to, take your drinking water to reconstitute your food. And of course, the MREs, they have their own way to heat themselves up. But freeze-dried meals are great for a bug-out type situation. They're also really good if you are having to dig into your food storage and you're eating a lot of beans, you're eating a lot of rice. Having freeze-dried meals, even though you might not be able to have full-size portions like what we're used to now, having a little bit of lasagna on your plate or having a little bit of chili mac on your plate, anything with meat, dead cow, chicken, any of that stuff, it could be a big psychological thing. And of course, it's still adding nutrients to your body, which is nice. The next type of foods that every prepper should store is going to be sugar and honey. Those have a lot of benefits. First of all, they make your food taste a whole lot better than they would without them. They can also provide your body with energy, and they make excellent barter items. When it comes to storing sugar, make sure that you store just plain white sugar. Brown sugar, kind of like with rice, can have extra stuff in it that robs you of its super long shelf life. And also, you want to make sure that it's in an airtight container because, as we all know, sugar, if any moisture gets introduced to it, can clump up, become hard, then it's difficult to deal with. But you want to avoid putting them into metal containers, things like, big like metal cans, stuff like that, just because in humid environments, the sugar can cause those containers to rust. So sugar in Mylar bags sealed up inside of a plastic bucket like what I have this stuff, that's a good idea. But you want to make sure to not put an oxygen absorber in there because it'll cause it to clump up and get hard like a rock. And when it comes to honey, you want to make sure that what you get is raw and unfiltered honey. That's going to have the longest shelf life. It's also going to have the most good stuff in it for your body. Pasteurized honey, it goes through some processes that remove a lot of the good stuff, and I believe it can also reduce its shelf life as well. Honey also has medicinal benefits. You can use it for things like sore throats to help soothe that, and it has antimicrobial abilities. There's even been instances of people dressing wounds with honey in situations where they didn't have anything else, and it does help with healing. The next type of food that every prepper should store is going to be herbs and spices. And like honey and sugar, they can go a long way towards making your food taste better and also give it more variety. Depending on the herbs and spices that you use when you're preparing your food, you can make the exact same beans and rice taste vastly different from one meal to another. Like I said earlier, here where I'm at, I love Mexican food, so I can use different types of herbs and spices to have Mexican beans and rice. Or I can use different herbs and spices to have kind of a nice spicy stew, especially if I can find maybe some small amounts of meat to put in there. So some examples of different types of seasonings, just your regular herbs, things like rosemary, dill. Then also, what's another one? Basil. There's just a whole bunch of them. And then more kind of like commercially prepared seasoning, things like Tony Chachere's. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but whatever. Different steak seasonings. Slap Your Mama's pretty good. Don't actually slap your mama. That's the name of a seasoning, but it's pretty darn tasty. I mean, the possibilities really with that type of thing are endless. And they have a pretty long shelf life. So if you store them in like maybe smaller Mylar bags, like I know that when I got mine, I got multi-pack that had gallon bags, quart bags, and then these small, tiny ones. And at first I was like, what am I going to use these stupid, tiny little bags for? But maybe emptying spices into them would be a good use for them. Now your spices in glass sealed up jars, they're probably going to be okay. You might just want to put them somewhere where they're not going to get much light exposure. But things in like little pouches or plastic containers, you might want to move those into Mylar. And along kind of the same vein as spices is you need to have salt. Salt is incredibly important for our body, and have some iodized salt as well so that you get that iodine content that your body needs. Another good thing about salt is that it can be used to help preserve your food if you know the proper ways to go about doing that. Now the question always comes up, how much food should you have stored? And the cop-out answer to that is as much as you possibly can, but that's not really all that helpful. So let's say that if you're somebody like me, okay? You're just a normal dude, or lady, you have a normal job, and maybe, you got bills, you got a kid, stuff like that. I would have a very hard time not worrying if I did not have at least a month's worth of food set aside. And really, that is a very reasonable amount of time to be preparing for even kind of smaller scale disasters, especially if you live in a coastal area. I know people that have been like 3 weeks or more without power because, say, of a hurricane. Now, if you aren't able to do that, maybe you're a college student watching this channel, or you're a single mom and you don't have that much, disposable income, I would do everything within my power to try to have at least 3 days to a week of food set aside as quickly as possible, like by the end of the day or by the end of the week. And the way you go about doing that is go to the store, get you the cheapest 10-pound bag or 8-pound bag of beans and rice that you can get, and then get some canned goods. And you also need a way to prepare those things, and I'll put a link to my video, How to Cook Indoors Without Electricity. I'll put a link in the description below. So, I mean, even if you are in kind of a bad financial situation, those dried beans, rice, and canned goods, they can provide you a lot of bang with your buck. And also, I did a video that was the first $100 that preppers should spend. I'll put a link for that in the description below as well. That might help some folks. I might do a follow-up video to that soon. But let's say that you've been prepping for a while and you have a little bit extra income. Then, I mean, really, the sky's the limit. I mean, aim for 3 months, then 6 months, a year, and then maybe even beyond. And it's important to understand that food storage is just one leg of an overall food plan. I think that you should have food set aside that really you just grab it and eat it. Then you should also have ways to get more food as you go along. I did a video over having a garden a while back, and also talked about things like hunting. If you're able to do that where you are now, if everything just goes to pot, then you might have some flexibility. But then also, I mean, do you know the edible plants in your area? So don't just focus on just this one element of a food plan, but you definitely need to have food storage, I think, kind of as the foundation of your food plan. And in addition to having food set aside, there are some other food-related items that aren't stuff that you can eat that are important to have as well. And the first thing that comes to mind is going to be a manual can opener. And there are many different kinds. You can get yourself a nice hand crank style can opener. And then there's other things like the P38 military can opener, which is about like that big. And you can probably fit one in your wallet, no problem at all. And then other types of can openers, like the ones found on multi-tools and Swiss Army knives. Those are great. Then also having ways to preserve food as you go along. Canning is an excellent thing to get into. It's something that I am looking into starting very soon. And if I do, then I'll be sure to feature some of that on my channel. Then also having, maybe some spare Mylar bags set aside. So where you go through, some like rice or beans and you have a little bit extra, a couple of quart bags set aside, then you can throw what you don't use in there, throw an O2 absorber in, zip it up, heat seal it, and then you can add that to your food storage. And another thing that you need to think about is how are you going to cook if you can no longer use your nice pots and pans on your ultra modern electric stovetop. So in situations where you might have to be cooking over an open flame, cast iron is definitely the way to go. Things like cast iron skittles, Dutch ovens, and griddles, they'll give you a lot of versatility so where you can cook pretty much anywhere. I did an article on my website a while back about basically what preppers need to know about cast iron. I'll be sure to link to that. And also, I will put a card for the how to cook indoors without electricity video that I mentioned a second ago right up here. So thank y'all again. Y'all have a good one.